Welcome to Know Before You Go for the 21st Sunday in Ordinary Time. I'm Father Don Goergen, the assistant to the provincial for the province. We have today a reading with which you are very familiar. It's the story of Jesus at Caesarea Philippi when he asks the disciples, "Who do the people say that I am?" And then he asks the question, "Who do you say that I am?" We're familiar with the text, but today this comes from the Gospel of Matthew, which is significantly different from the version we have in the Gospel of Mark. In the Gospel of Mark, Jesus asks that question, and he asks them, the disciples and us, "Who do you say that I am?" But actually in the Gospel of Matthew, the focus shifts away from Jesus and really on Peter, because Peter then makes his well-known confession of faith, and in doing so, Jesus responds, "Blessed are you, Simon, son of Jonah." And so it shifts to Peter, and then Jesus says three things, really, that are of importance for us to consider today. He says to Peter, "You will be like a rock. You are no longer Simon. You will be called Peter," which in Greek and Latin is a word that means rock. "You are Peter, and upon you I will build my church." And then secondly, he says, "And the gates of the netherworld shall not prevail against it." And then he says, "And I will give you the keys of the kingdom of heaven." So it's much more about Peter in the Gospel of Matthew than it is really about the question that Jesus originally asks. So let us consider for a moment these things that Jesus says to Peter. "You, Peter, are or will be a rock. I'm counting on you, Peter, for that." Now, that in itself is significant and rather incredible in some ways. I myself, knowing what we know about Peter prior to this moment, I would not have been inclined to choose Peter for this particular significant role that he will play following the resurrection. I would have thought perhaps James or John. These are the three he takes up to the Mount of Transfiguration. I think I might have chosen John, but in fact, Jesus sees something in Peter that perhaps we have not seen thus far. He can see into Peter's heart, and he knows that this is what he needs: someone who speaks boldly, and someone on whom he can count, and someone who has a certain practicality to him. And so, Peter, you need to know that I am counting on you. And in that sense, really, upon us also as church. You are Peter, and upon this rock I will build my church. But then he says something really quite incredible. He says, the gates of the netherworld, the gates of hell, will not prevail against it, will not prevail against the church. In other words, ultimately, God will prevail. Here we have to stop and ask ourselves a question. Do we believe this? Do we believe Jesus? Do we really believe that in the end, come what may, and especially living in the times in which we live, that God will prevail? Putting it that way, we might say yes, but it does make us pause and think about what God has promised, that come what may, the gates of hell will not prevail. And then after that, he says to Peter, "And I will give you the keys of the kingdom of heaven. What you bind on earth, what you loose on earth, etc. I will give you the keys." In fact, our first reading today is from the prophet Isaiah, in which the keys are taken by the Lord from one person who does not deserve them, and given to Eliakim another upon whom God will be able to place his trust. And so we have that sense of the keys being entrusted to those whom God trusts. The keys have really been given to Peter, and through Peter to the church, and therefore to us. And therefore, what's tough again to believe is that God trusts us. God believes in us, that indeed God counts on us. And so in all of these, we can ask ourselves that question: do I believe God? Do I believe what God has promised? That whatever, in the end, as Julian of Norwich said, all will be well. And in accepting that promise in hope, that we are then aware that we are called into partnership with God, that once Jesus leaves and is raised from the dead and gives us that gift of the Holy Spirit, God counts on us. Do I believe Jesus? Do I trust God? Do I trust God's promise to include us and count on us? Is God trustworthy? Sometimes we may doubt, not necessarily God's doing what we want him to do, but God will prevail. In fact, our second reading from Paul's letter to the Romans says, how wonderful and unsearchable the ways and the wisdom of God. And perhaps that's what we're left with on this day, to marvel at the mystery in which we find ourselves, which is the mystery of God himself. How wonderful is that mystery, how unsearchable God's ways, but God has chosen to entrust his promise to us, and has promised that with us, indeed, it will be fulfilled. God trusts us. We need to trust ourselves, but we also need to believe that we need God in the challenges that face us. God bless you, and be safe.